I'm going to start the recording and then start sharing my screen.
By the way, are you going to put the recording somewhere online afterward?
Yep.
Oh, okay. May I ask where are you going to be sharing it?
I'm not quite sure yet. So if you'll hold that question for a minute, I will slide about this. Let me just figure out how to present while also on Zoom. Okay.
Cool.
Okay, great. Well, welcome everyone to our session. I'm Jingying, and Bobi, will you also give me
Hi, everyone.
And so just a couple of housekeeping things before we get started. We'll be recording our portion of the presentation, mine and Bobi's, for public consumption, and then we'll stop the recording before discussion and Q&A. Discussion and Q&A will be in Chatham House rules. So if you have questions that you would like not to be recorded, please save them for the end. That'll be in, probably 40-ish minutes. And if you want to say something, please use the hand raising function on Zoom to get our attention or chat. And all items in the public Zoom chat that are like links or anything will copy over to the Slack channel if you happen to be using it. Otherwise, use the Slack. And then does anyone want to be the note taker for this session? No worries if not, Bobi and I will do it. Okay, cool. Great. Then I'm going to jump in. I would love it if we could all just go around and introduce ourselves for 30 seconds each. Maybe name, affiliation, and why you're interested in this session. I'll start. I have to call on people. I'll start with Alexa.
Okay. Hi. First of all, I'm sorry that I didn't volunteer to take notes. I'm a terrible note taker. I'm an anthropologist, and I'm at the University of Cambridge, and I work with the CSER, which is the Center for the Study of Existential Risk, and I'm also an affiliate with the Leverhulme for the Future of Intelligence. And yeah, I'm really interested in ethnography, so that's what I do and why I am curious about this, and yeah, excited to have this conversation.
Great, thank you. Tianyu, do you want to go next?
Oh yes. So sorry. Okay. So my name is Tianyu. I really interested in how AICP can help, how AGI can help or not help big companies, and I have worked in IBM on AI, and very interested in how it could actually be related, and it's a continuous interest of me. So would like to listen in here.
Great, Jeremy.
Oh, there we go. Okay. So I'm here. I was attracted by the organizing for beneficial AGI. Definitely an interest. What it looks like to put together, present and near-term projects, specifically in creating more trust in society. That's where my interest has been, and I've published in that too.
Great, thank you. And Jessica.
Sorry, my dog has chosen this moment to go crazy. I'm gonna try to calm down. One
second. Maybe it's a good chance for you to introduce yourself, Bobi.
Hi everyone. I've been a research fellow with PAI, which has been really great working on this project and the bottom-up project. And outside of that, I've been working in industry with a group called Responsible AI that is working very closely to what we're going to present in this session.
At Accenture?
Yeah, with Accenture. And also, it's been interesting being involved with some of the standardization efforts at IEEE that are also very relevant to this discussion.
Thanks, Bobi. Jessica, back to you.
Thank you. Yeah, so I'm Jessica Cousins-Newman. I'm a research fellow at the UC Berkeley Center for Long-Term Cybersecurity, and also work as an AI policy specialist with the Future of Life Institute. And yeah, I'm just really interested to learn about what PAI's findings have been on this topic. So thank you.
Great. And I'm Jingying. I am at the Partnership on AI. I've been working with Bobi on this research project, and it's been really great because we've been able to get some really good insights from AI industry practitioners, and we're really excited to share with you all how we think that applies to kind of the long-term community and what lessons we can really draw from that. So I will just jump into our presentation. So here's the rough agenda. I'll spend about 15 minutes going over why now is the time to think about organizational structure for AGI teams. Bobi will present some lessons from the AI industry based on our findings from this study, and then we'll switch to non-recording and have a discussion with all of you. So as an introduction, the Partnership on AI, along with Accenture, has been conducting research on organizational enablers and barriers to kind of fair ML and responsible AI work. That's really talking about kind of fairness, accountability, and transparency in machine learning, which is a research community that is thinking about those issues, and also broader concerns about responsible AI. And the findings in our research will be based on 25 ethnographic interviews that we've done with AI practitioners in the AI industry. There's more information in the appendix of all of these slides about our study design. And the goal today is to really frame how this research on FairML actually provides a blueprint for how to create mission-aligned organizations, which are crucial for creating beneficial AGI, and to share findings from the research and how these lessons can be leveraged to build stronger AGI-oriented teams. The outcomes for today, hopefully, are that you all leave here seeing the importance of human organization and processes for positive technical outcomes, and to maybe take away 1 to 3 action items for how to transform your own team and organization into a more mission-aligned place. So what do we mean by organizational structure and culture? Organizational structure consists of the infrastructure and processes that constrain and guide how groups of people within an organization behave, while organizational culture is more of the norms, values, and philosophy that influence how groups of people within an organization behave. And you can see these really are shaping each other. The infrastructure and processes will shape what norms develop in an organization. The values of an organization will shape, in turn, what processes they put into place. And why are these things so important for thinking about building transformational AGI is what I will go over in the next few slides. So organizational structure and culture play a really big role in outcomes. A concrete example of this is when you look at the company Zappos compared to Theranos. So at Zappos, they had a culture of meritocracy where promotions and bonuses were based on really demonstrated skill and tests of capabilities and how employees lived the 10 values that were core to Zappos. On the value alignment piece, culture fit is about 50% of their hiring criteria, and feedback culture is really robust and honest. The outcome was that within 10 years of founding, they were acquired by Amazon for over $1 billion. On the other hand, you have Theranos, where a culture of favoritism really flourished. Promotions and bonuses were really based on personal relationships with the leadership. Fraud was fairly rampant, and whistleblowers were called out and punished and actually intimidated in some cases. And the outcome for Theranos was that the company went out of business, and the company and CEO were sued or investigated by numerous people. So definitely a stark contrast. And the culture and structures within each of those organizations very much played into these outcomes. And we really think that the organizational structure impact will be actually magnified for Black Swan type events, because Black Swan events share these characteristics of being highly uncertain, high impact, rapidly changing, and also large scale. And all of these characteristics really exacerbate and amplify the difference that we were talking about with Zappos and Theranos. So taking the COVID-19 example as an example of a black swan event, there is a clear kind of emergent theme that there are countries with poorly aligned responses and countries with well-aligned responses. So on the poorly aligned part, what we mean is there are broken feedback cycles, kind of fragmented experimentation and response, piecemeal lockdown efforts driven by a mix of companies, local governments, and other jurisdictions. A shortage of personal protective equipment and testing leads to unreliable care and unreliable identification of cases. And we see in those places that are experiencing this poorly aligned response, there's rapidly increasing infection rate and healthcare systems are starting to get overwhelmed. On the other hand, we have places that have actually mounted a really well-aligned response. So there has been really rapid data sharing, publication of research, immediate large-scale lockdown driven by centralized governments often, redirection of resources to make test kits and PPE quickly to scale testing and care. And the results and outcomes on that side are flattening infection curves and actually having the capacity to care for the seriously ill. And if you compare kind of fatality rates across some of these locations, there is an emerging difference as well. So really, we believe that organizational structure has an even magnified amplitude of impact for black swan type events. And AGI could lead to a transformational black swan event, which means that building AGI requires organizing people towards a common goal and maintaining mission alignment through a lot of changes, possibly over a long period of time or through really dramatic shifts, and also in the face of a lot of uncertainty. So all of that means that, especially for beneficial AGI, we really need robust, resilient, and effective organizational culture and structures. Another insight that we wanted to share from other industries is that as technical industries scale, they tend to actually start focusing less on technical problems and more towards human coordination issues. Not that they don't also focus on the technical issues, but actually as they scale, the human coordination issues get more and more complex. So we really see this within the AI industry. What the academic research chooses to prioritize is often technical issues, whereas AI practitioners really need guidance on organizational challenges. And that's a gap that our particular research is trying to bridge for the AI industry. Whereas in the AGI community, we know that there is a lot of focus on technical AI safety, and there's also emerging interest and a lot of work on AI governance and strategy. And the gap that we would like to use these lessons to prevent is the gap between all of that great thinking and the tactical implementation of all of this alignment as this AGI community scales as well. Luckily, decades of research exist on how to effectively bring people together towards shared goals. So we have plotted here a number of different bodies of literature and research. And we really believe that taking lessons from all of these will be crucial for our shared goal of creating beneficial AGI. And the research that we're going to share today specifically draws heavily on industrial organizational psychology, organizational science, and anthropology. And we want to really point out that incorporating public good has been a challenge across a lot of previous technological transitions. So often there's a new technology, then people identify concerns for the public good that may or may not be addressed immediately with that technology. And often there's an emergent community that leads change that actually makes those technologies better for people and society. So as an example, we had cars emerge in the last century. And then also with cars emerged the behavior of drunk driving, which is obviously very dangerous for a lot of people. And the organization called Mothers Against Drunk Driving was a really strong advocate for policy change in this space. Similarly, with furniture, there was a crisis around tip over and children getting crushed under furniture when it fell over. And actually, parents were instrumental in advocating for design change at the product level and also for policy change on a regulatory level. And similarly with machine learning, there's been a lot of emergent concerns about fairness and bias within the last maybe 5 years. And that's really for the public good, because fairness is so important for justice and all of these things. And there's been an emergent research community called the FACT community that has been really looking into these issues. And finally, mapping it to AGI, I think the concern for public good there has been really focused a lot on safety, and the AI safety community has emerged to take charge of this issue and try to plan out ways that we can head off some of these safety issues. So these latter two are really emerging communities, and we want to share a great framework about how transitions can occur between sort of the existing kind of technological shift and becoming more aware of these societal impacts. So this is a framework called the Two Loops framework from the Berkana Institute, and it really maps out how new social movements emerge. And we really think that it's really applicable for something like beneficial AGI, because it's really thinking about how to integrate this concept of the public good into every aspect of this industry. So you have at the beginning pioneering practices that start to emerge within a dominant system that might be less interested in these issues. Then you have enabling practices within the dominant system, which might include funding and policies. And then you have hospice work, which means work that is aimed at stopping the practices that were hindering some of these pioneer practices. On the other hand, you start to connect and form networks of connected efforts of these pioneering practices. You build communities of practice and grow coherence as a whole field. And that in that way, the transition is navigated towards actually having these emergent practices. Of course, there are also outliers outside the system, which informs some of these emergent practices as well. So actually for today's event in general, these networks of connected efforts and forming communities of practice is a thing that we are all doing together. So it's great because this, I think, framework really captures how we can together all help to scale this line of thinking. And this is just an alternative view of that framework with a bit more detail of how this has been used to bring social innovation to scale. And we really think that this is a great framework to imbue into this community. So I think the AGI community has a real opportunity to design institutions to avoid the gap that exists elsewhere. And the gap is really between having mission alignment as a nice to have versus having mission alignment as an indispensable process. So what we mean by that is, for example, in the nice to have scenario, safety work would be ad hoc. It would rely on volunteer time. It would be always pitted against sort of business interests or other interests for priority and resources. Whereas if it became an indispensable process, then safety work would be seen as actually crucial to business interests and then become integrated into all of the workflows and have dedicated staffing and internal structure for education and scaling. So our goal and question for this presentation today is really, can we learn some lessons from other industries like the AI industry as a whole to prevent this gap from opening up, or to actually help us design in the first place in the aspirational state? So I want to make a pitch for why we want to prioritize organizational structure and design right now, and why we need to bring in all these lessons from other industries. And right now it's because many AGI-oriented organizations are actually still small. There's definitely some exceptions to that, but it's always less costly to build a new system than to retrofit an old one. So if we set it up well now, we'll actually be more efficient than if we set it up a different way and then later have to retrofit it. So right now is a great time because the organizations are still small and we can really set up the processes however we want based on what works from other industries. And starting now also leaves more time for informed experimentation before scaling and takeoff. So I think that's another benefit from a sequencing perspective. And bringing in lessons from other industries, I think, is really crucial because it's free to learn from other people's mistakes and much more expensive to make our own. And then also exposure to more threat models from other disciplines can mean more resilient plans for the AGI community. And given how uncertain all of this is, that resilience will be really key. So now I will turn it over to Bobi to present some of the findings from our study.
Okay, wonderful. And I will share my screen. I think it's, okay, great. And we can keep going. Okay, perfect. I will go on with telling you a little bit about the motivation behind the study we've done. And show you the results and the discussions around them and how are they relevant, and then Jingying will jump in to also make it more relevant for the AGI community. Okay, so what was the motivation? Part of it was the work by computer scientist Melvin Conway, who formulated this hypothesis called Conways Law, which pretty much demonstrates how organizational structure directly shapes what systems are being built. So he stated that organizations which develop systems are constrained to produce designs which are copies of the communication structures of these organizations. And of course, this has been studied in other fields, such as organizational science and some of the other literature that Jingying brought in. But we saw that in computer science as well, there has been some very, very interesting research on that. So here are some of the analysis graphs from Conway's original paper on this. And if you focus first on the one on the left, what it demonstrates is that systems have subsystems as components, and they literally have APIs in order to have subcomponents connect and interact between each other. So in a way, all of computer science have been influenced by object-oriented programming, and that is one of the core concepts there, that those APIs are gonna be crucial between how software functions. And similarly, in the design and development of AI, we cannot escape from this core concepts in pure software programming. On the right side of this, the diagram, you see a comparison between the structure of these subcomponents interacting between each other and organizational structure. So it's interesting that the linear graph notation is useful because it provides an abstraction which has the same form for the two entities we're considering. On the one hand, the design of the organization, and on the other hand, the design of the system. So actually, Conway in his paper looks at federal government when he designs and go through this research. So if it's interesting to you, definitely have a look at his work. Here's an example demonstration of different organizational structures, such that you can imagine how each of them will inevitably influence the structure of the outcomes that comes out of those organizations. And you've probably seen this graphic in media. Actually, Harvard Business School has framed these concepts of the same Conway law as the mirroring hypothesis. And they've drawn from the literature on organization design and organizations as complex systems, as well as on the literature on product design and products as complex systems, while doing a review of 142 empirical studies of organizations in industry, as well as open collaborative projects, like open source projects, in order to investigate if Conway's law holds in practice. Even though their study was conducted in 2016, none of the organizations they looked at are developing AI products or services. So considering the supply chain of AI-enabled products and systems, it is interesting to consider if and where does the mirroring hypothesis hold. Ultimately, we wanted to ask the question of what organizational structure could enable mission alignment in the way machine learning design, development, and deployment happens in organizations at the moment. So here's the methodology that we had for the study, and you can read a lot more of that in the paper that we're writing at the moment. Over the last 7 months, we conducted 25 interviews with industry practitioners involved in work on misuse and unintended consequences of machine learning. Key criteria for the participants was that the output of their work should have impact on real products and services beyond research. And you can see the various types of roles people had in our study so far. Legal, including legal policy, program managers, ethicists, research scientists, software engineers, data science, and others. There were many common perspectives that we heard practitioners express repeatedly. While conducting the interviews, we saw the need for thematic analysis, which encompasses 3 clusters of data, sort of the dominant and emergent state and the aspirational future state that practitioners imagined. The analysis within the prevalent or dominant state comprises of what we saw as most common in the data. The emerging state includes what emerged as work practices, which are common across practitioners but not prevalent. And then the aspirational future state consists of ideas and perspectives practitioners shared when explicitly asked about what they envision for the ideal future state of their work within the organizational context. And actually, when doing the part about aspirational future state, we utilize a future forecasting framework in order to take participants through a mapping exercise of what does that future state look like. So here on the left, this dominant emerging state visual actually comes from this paper, and we thought it's an interesting representation of emergence that we're seeing in evolutionary biology and like other, many other fields, as well as the organizational practices that are emerging in the intersection of AI, AGI, and these other fields that we're bringing in this discussion. Okay, so here's a summary of these different dominant, emerging, and aspirational states. And here you see the different trends that we identified during the thematic analysis. And we'll go through them one after the other, so they'll make more sense. But in general, all of these trends were transitions from the current dominant state towards this future aspirational state, where mission alignment is perceived as an indispensable process inside organizations, leading to improved outcomes. While in the current state, very often it is perceived much more as a nice to have, and it's only embedded in the mindset and behavior of individuals within organizations. Okay, so in the current state, many times organizations are reactive. The work that they do is fragmented. The most common incentive for change is catastrophic media intention and decreasing media tolerance. Fair machine learning, fairness, accountability, and transparency of machine learning is often perceived as a taboo topic, and the questions come up, such as whose job is this? The work is often not compensated, and it's completely voluntary. It is also perceived as too complicated and not easy to understand. In the emerging state, we saw that some organizations have set up proactive evaluation and investigation processes that provide support and oversight structures for people within the organization. There was support from legal and policy teams, and there are also standardized review processes. Participants reported proactively using various internal communication channels and strategies, such as taking screenshots of problematic algorithmic outcomes, organizing internal discussions, meetups where they would report concerns and latest research in this field, a growing number of educational initiatives on onboarding and upskilling of employees has started, as well as educating customers on how to use products. this was a very major point where people express more so for the anticipatory future state that we really need ways to educate people about potential misuse and unintended consequences of the AI that is being developed inside the organization. Also, people reported the need for clear and transparent communication internally and externally, incorporating technical and non-technical tools that orchestrate algorithmic assessments, evaluations, both again internally and externally for customers utilizing the produced algorithmic models in different contexts. Some practitioners reported their concerns if they should even engage with a client without the use of some sort of assessment framework. They expressed many ethical and tensions that they've had personally with certain clients, and the lack of organizational support and structure to help them navigate that. They reported that traditional engineering mindset needs to change towards being more adaptive and dynamic, aligned with the dynamic nature of the issues around misuse and unintended use of AI. Then in the current state, most dominant state among what practitioners shared with us was the lack of metrics. The need to communicate lack of metrics to clients. It's hard to have strong KPIs for many of the issues under unintended consequences of misuse of AI, and that makes it even harder for practitioners who are trying to have these metrics as part of their process of design and development. Many times practitioners were not sure how to measure impact, and quantifying what they do was really difficult because it was often in this qualitative space where we often lack metrics, or these metrics exist in other like social science fields or other disciplines that are making it harder to apply in the pure engineering work. Oftentimes people reported use of inappropriate metrics and academics metrics being very difficult to apply in industry contexts. For example, user engagement and positive user experience is often not a metric easily utilized by researchers, but is a metric that industry practitioners are measured upon. Many participants reported being measured on generating revenue and delivering work. In some cases, they've used the enabling argument that mitigating unintended consequences and misuse kinds of risks prior to launch is a lot cheaper than once you've launched something and it goes sideways. However, again, like without actual metrics, it's much harder for them to prove that to their organizational leadership. Many of our practitioners talked to us about the misalignment in the organization in terms of ethics guidelines, best practices, what is the organizational strategy on that. Then many times organizations reward efforts focus on internal or organizational structures in order to internal organizational education in order to enable practitioners to navigate that space and bring awareness to these potential issues. Some of the organizations reported enabling collaborations where organizational structure is set up in order to enable practitioners to more closely collaborate with marginalized communities or practitioners in other organizations or academia. They express the need for easier ways to engage with external communities, as well as understanding legal considerations and policy considerations that often make it difficult. In the future state, participants reported that the organization could have a tangible strategy on implementing assessments and evaluations around misuse and unintended consequences. And it is something that their teams are measured against So it's part of their performance evaluation process. Then production teams employ qualitative methods together with existing evaluation metrics in order to capture concerns. And mechanisms exist to enable collaborations. Organizational structure that could enable practitioners to more closely collaborate with outside communities. Help in defining benchmarks and making sure everything is performing well after deployment. And this continuous monitoring keeps happening. Many times in the dominant systems, participants reported lack of accountability structures inside of the organization. They pretty much didn't know who's accountable when there is a potential risk of unintended consequences. Most commonly, participants reported that their organization has, in some ways, very obscure roles, and there is a latent uncertainty about role definitions and responsibilities for this line of work. Several practitioners expressed that they needed to be a senior person in the organization in order to make their concerns heard. And reputational risk was the biggest incentive for their line of work. Practitioners would use it as a leverage point, but again, it wasn't as clear as a use case how to take advantage of that in order to drive organizational change. In the emerging state, many organizations have developed scaffolding to support the work on misuse and unintended consequences. Organizations have the ability to allow people to craft their own roles in a more dynamic way, informed both by internal and external factors, and communities such as our community. Accountability is distributed across organizational structures, and issues get confidently escalated to management. Teams are held accountable to what they've committed to, and as part of their performance evaluation, they include metrics that correspond to unintended consequences of misuse. And this happens through internal review boards, publication and release norms, and documentation and transparency guidelines. But that is where we really go into the aspirational future states, where more and more organizations are having these clearly defined practices around organizational scaffolding that can support people to do this line of work. And maybe they have institutionalized roles where that the work on investigated and unintended consequences and misuse is seen as the main job that the person does, and it's not a sort of volunteering or +1 that they do. There are more collaborations and partnership-based multi-stakeholder frameworks that allow people to do this line of work. And lastly, the last trend we saw was going from fragmented to more aligned kind of work. And here in this dominant state, oftentimes there was misalignment between individuals, teams, and organizational level incentives and mission statements. Individuals are doing ad hoc work based on personal values or assessment of importance. There's spread of information, which relies on individual relationships within their organization. How they communicate is a key factor. What is their trust relationship and ability to navigate multiple levels of hierarchy within the organization. Many people talked about organizational inertia and obscured organizational structures which are making it very difficult to do their work. Algorithmic impacts are often diffuse or hard to identify. There was lack of data for sensitive groups to help with evaluation and testing for the impact and unintended consequences of their technology. Data collected internally at a company is extremely biased, and practitioners reported having multiple challenges around building grassroots actions in the organization around the need for collaboration with external groups. in the emerging state, we saw that overly rigid organizational incentives can demotivate addressing the tensions that we're discussing. Part of the work within investigated unintended consequences is very much related to conflict resolution and managing conflicts between different stakeholders inside organization, which may lead to stress and burnout for the people that are doing this sort of work, which is what we saw emerging in the data that people reported. Many times we saw that people are incentivized to produce complex solutions to problems, and complexity is rewarded and incentivized whether or not it is needed. And again, around organizational inertia, competition and competing priorities make it challenging to justify certain research agendas, and especially to make them relevant to industry projects. Many times, industry-specific product-related problems may not have sufficient research merit, or more specifically, an ability for the researcher to publish. And many practitioners express that as a challenge for them to collaborate with their research teams and more effectively work on some of the issues that they've seen in industry. Lastly, in the aspirational future state, ethical tensions are resolved in accordance with organizational level mission and values. Organizational leadership understands, supports, and deeply engages with the concerns around misuse and unintended consequences. There are many ways in which organizational culture is aligned with the topics of the discussion in a way that it lets go of the fear of being scrutinized, and organizations function more fluently. Every single person understands risk. Collectively as teams, we understand the risks. And also we have leaders who talk about risk publicly and admit when mistakes happen. And now jumping back to Jingying. And we don't hear you, Jingying. Unmute. Great.
Okay, great. Hear me now? So what does, putting that together, Bobi presented a lot of our findings across these 4 themes. So really pulling those 4 together, what does it look like all in one picture for what we think an aspirational AGI organization could look like? So results are defined to include societal impact, measured through data-driven efforts, and the results on those societal impact measures are actually tied to compensation and financials. That's one piece. Another piece would be that the organization would have deployed frameworks that incorporate anticipating risks in a low friction way so that it's not onerous for people to do so. Ethical tensions in work are resolved in accordance with the org level mission and values, which keeps everyone aligned. And responsibilities for safety and societal impact are integrated throughout business processes related to product teams and decision making. And that's pretty aspirational, and it's also a little bit vague in terms of how do we actually get from what people have today to what that looks like. So we don't have concrete answers because we haven't been able to test these solutions yet, but I want to share some potential solutions for getting to the aligned future that were brainstormed by our participants in a previous workshop, and we'd love to hear your feedback and thoughts about these. So one is effective veto power on projects. So this should be available to multiple levels. There needs to be whistleblower protections for people who do bring up whether or not an ML product or a particular project should go forward. And a no based on a lack of mission alignment should always halt work. We need to combine internal and external pressure. Neither alone is sufficient. Internal oversight can be more detailed, whereas external pressure can add a lot of motivation. And then we need to build robust communication channels, keeping people in dialogue and aligned across all of these different levels and internally and externally. And for this to work, you need structures to make the debate actually really fruitful that can even out power dynamics and ensure that people actually disagree in productive ways. And then leveraging feedback loops is another potential solution, which is that all of these other solutions really work in tandem. So for example, the whistleblower protections are needed to let people honestly use the channels of communication. And so key takeaways from today's presentation are really, one, now is a really good time to intentionally design organizational structures for teams that are building towards beneficial AGI, because it's usually less costly and easier to build a new process than to retrofit an old one. Two, look to lessons from other industries to avoid reinventing the wheel. And then three, expect to continue investing in maintenance of processes and infrastructure. This is actually extremely challenging, and we see it across a lot of other places that people who do that have better outcomes. And maintaining alignment as the organizations really scale has been historically very challenging, so we should anticipate that it'll be challenging in this context as well. So with that, I'm going to stop recording and